Dust swirled along Main Street as steady footsteps climbed the hotel stairs, each one drawing closer to the door Jonathan Crowell held shut with both hands. He braced his shoulder to the wood and whispered a promise into the silence, ready to act before the past swallowed the town again. What waited on the other side would test everything he thought he'd come here to forget. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. The deed to Silver Hollow fit into Jonathan Crowell's breast pocket like a folded prayer. He had paid $100, hard coins saved from cattle sold at a loss, to buy what everyone else had abandoned: a wind-bent street, a shuttered saloon, a blacksmith shop with a missing door, and a squat hotel whose windows stared like tired eyes toward the low red hills. It was late spring of 1878, and the rains had been stingy. Dust rode the breeze in pale veils, and the sun went down as if it too were weary of looking at this corner of the New Mexico territory. He tied his bay gelding to the hitching post in front of the hotel and listened. The only sound was the lazy rattle of the sign chain above him, tapping against the bracket like a spoon on an empty cup. Behind that, a farther hush, the high desert's kind, old quiet. Crickets testing the evening, a coyote thinking about it. He had come for that quiet, to let it wrap the raw places life had left in him. Grief, he'd learned, moved slower than winter. It needed space. Inside, the lobby wore a long coat of dust. A ledger lay open on the front desk. 6 years of emptiness since the last guest wrote his name. Jonathan ran a finger along the edge of the counter and left a clean line like a creek through silt. He found a broom in the corner and began to sweep, because some things must be done before a man sits down in a place and calls it his. The work felt good, simple, honest, patient, the way cattle used to move when you came alongside them quiet and didn't shout. He lit a lamp as the light thinned and carried it upstairs. Floorboards answered him with gentle complaints. In each room he opened windows that stuck at first, then gave, letting in the dry perfume of sage. He pictured fresh linens, a wash basin, a chair by the window where he might read the Bible he kept in his saddlebags. In the last room the lamp flickered. He tipped it slightly, coaxing the flame. That was when he heard it, a footfall that wasn't his. He froze and listened. The house breathed around him, the faint sway of the sign outside, the tiny tick of cooling nails in the wall. Then, again, and closer, the hush of a step, then another, like someone careful on old wood. Jonathan's hand went to his belt out of habit, stopping at the empty space where a holster might hang. He had chosen to come here without one. The West had enough iron and anger without him adding to the count. He set the lamp on the bureau and moved to the hallway, head tilted, breath held. The sound had come from below. On the stairs he descended slowly, testing his weight on each tread. He told himself it was wind or a loose shutter. He told himself a lot of things that weren't true lately, because the truth, his wife gone, the ranch nearly lost, the years heavy, asked for company. At the landing, the lobby lay in amber from the lamp's reach above, soft as memory. Nothing moved. He stepped off the last stair and the hotel answered with a faint whisper behind the front desk. He rounded the counter and found a low door he hadn't noticed, a service hatch to the cellar, set into the floor, iron ring, dull with rust. The whisper came again. Not a word. Exactly. More like cloth against wood. Jonathan crouched, listening with the patience that had once made him a decent cattleman. The sound stilled when he breathed too loudly, then returned when he held his breath. The untrained quiet a frightened creature makes. "Hello?" he said softly, and the word felt too big in the stillness. No reply. Just the quiet gathering itself, like a person trying to be smaller. He fetched the lamp from upstairs and set it near the hatch, its glow laying a circle on the floor. The iron ring was cold in his palm. He pulled, and the hatch lifted a few inches before something below snagged it. He paused, swallowed and eased it up, mindful not to startle whatever waited under there. Cool air breathed out of the dark, carrying the scent of earth and potato sacks. It was not the smell of danger, it was the smell of keeping. He lowered the lamp until its light touched stairs and stone, and the shadow at the bottom shifted back, the way a deer will when it thinks only its outline gives it away. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, surprising himself with how steady he sounded. A year ago, his voice would have trembled with everything it had lost. Tonight, it answered to something quieter, a plain intention, to be decent where decency had run thin. Another sound rose, a delicate clink, and he saw it, a tin cup on the last step. No hand on it now, but the mark of a hand recent. Hunger leaves traces, and so does care. He felt it then, a thread running from the cellar to the stairs to his own chest, the unmistakable tug of responsibility. He stood there a long moment, between the dark he didn't know and the light he could hold, and the town around him felt less like a ruin and more like a question. He had come to Silver Hollow to be alone. The world, it seemed, had other plans. He set the lamp on the step and knelt to speak again, but before he could, a single word rose from the cellar, barely more than breath. "Please." Jonathan didn't move at first. The word, thin, strained, and trembling, settled into him like a pebble in still water, sending quiet ripples he couldn't ignore. He eased the lamp a little lower, its warm glow reaching further into the cellar. At the bottom of the narrow stairs stood a girl, no older than 12. Her hair hung in uneven strands, as if it had been cut with a dull knife, and her dress was worn nearly to threads. She clutched the edge of a blanket that looked more like burlap than cloth. Behind her, in the shadows, came the sound of a shallow, uneven cough. Jonathan's voice was calm, but it carried the weight of a man who'd spent years speaking only when necessary. "Name?" She hesitated, eyes darting toward the coughing in the darkness. "Emily," she said finally. "Emily Carter." He nodded slowly. "And down there with you, my grandpa," she whispered. "He's sick, She cut herself short, as if even explaining too much might invite danger. Jonathan's instinct was to step down into the cellar, but one look at her, barefoot, wary, told him to move slow. The West didn't breed trust easily. "Got any food?" he asked. Emily shook her head. "We had potatoes. They went bad. I only come out at night sometimes. But..." Her voice trailed into the kind of silence that tells more than words. Jonathan let out a slow breath. "Wait here." Upstairs, he rummaged through his saddlebag and found half a loaf of bread and a wrapped piece of dried venison. He returned, crouched at the cellar entrance and handed them down. Emily's fingers grazed his, cold and thin. She took the food but didn't eat right away. She broke it into smaller pieces, setting a portion aside, likely for the man in the shadows. He watched her for a moment before speaking again. "How long you been here?" Emily's gaze flicked toward the cellar wall as if counting days on some invisible calendar. "Since before the snow melted. Grandpa said we'd be safe here, but they'll come back, they always do." "They?" Her mouth pressed into a thin line. She looked older in that moment, the way children do when they've learned too soon how the world can break things. The coughing came again, more ragged this time. Emily glanced back, then up at Jonathan. "Please don't tell anyone we're here." Jonathan leaned against the edge of the hatch, studying her in the lamplight. He had bought Silver Hollow to escape the world's noise, not to step into someone else's fight. But the thing about a plea like that, it lodged itself under your skin. He set the lamp down, its light casting his shadow long across the cellar steps. "Emily," he said, "I don't reckon I'm the kind of man who turns away when someone asks for help." She didn't smile. Trust wasn't won so quick, but her shoulders eased just slightly. Jonathan straightened and closed the hatch halfway, leaving a crack for light to spill through. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said. Her voice followed him as he crossed the dusty lobby. "They'll find out you helped us," she warned. Jonathan paused at the door, looking out at the dark street. Somewhere beyond the hills, a coyote called, long and low. "Then they'll have to live with it," he replied. But as he stepped out into the cool night air, he knew the words weren't as simple as they sounded. In towns like these, kindness had a cost, and the bill always came due. The sun lifted slow over the red horizon, dragging its light across the empty street of Silver Hollow. A thin veil of dust swirled at knee-height, moving wherever the wind chose. Jonathan stepped out of the hotel, the boards beneath his boots creaking in protest. His breath lingered in the cool air, curling into the dawn before disappearing. Much like the promises men made in these parts, he worked without rush but without pause. The rope at the well was dry and stiff, so he eased it down inch by inch until the bucket kissed water. The effort brought a low burn to his shoulders, the kind of honest ache that reminded him he was still made of muscle and bone. Back at the hotel porch, he patched a splintered tread on the stairs, his knife-shaving curls of wood that drifted to the ground like pale feathers. Through all of it, the image of the girl in the cellar clung to him, the sharp lines of her collarbones, the hollowness in her cheeks, the guarded stillness in her eyes. He had seen calves orphaned too young carry that same look. Her grandfather's cough was a different memory entirely, one that whispered of winters too hard and of sickness that settled in deep, not the kind you walked away from without a fight. By mid-morning, Jonathan saddled his gelding. Fairwater lay 12 miles east, a ride long enough to let a man think too much. The trail cut through open flats dotted with sagebrush, their silver leaves whispering in the wind. Beyond them, the land rose toward rust-colored bluffs, where shadows pooled in the cracks like secrets. Fairwater was already stirring when he arrived. Store doors open, horses shifting at the rail, the smell of coffee drifting out from the cafe. He swung down at the general store, dust falling from his coat in a small cloud. The store smelled of molasses, tobacco, and burlap. He began gathering what he needed: flour, beans, coffee, lard, a few strips of jerky, keeping his eyes on the shelves. The owner's greeting was polite enough, but the air carried a subtle stiffness, like a poker table gone quiet. As Jonathan counted coins onto the counter, he felt it. Eyes on his back. Through the front window, two men leaned against the hitch rail, the same ones he had noticed on an earlier trip. One had his arms folded, hat brim low enough to hide most of his face. The other rested a boot on the rail, his coat shifting just enough to show a badge-shaped emblem pinned inside, not the star of any marshal, but something crafted to look official. Their stillness was deliberate, the way hunters stand when they want the prey to notice without running. The coins were swept into the till without small talk, and Jonathan packed his supplies into his saddlebags. The ride home was quieter than the morning trip. The wind had dropped, and in its place came a brittle kind of stillness. On the far side of a dry arroyo, he noticed fresh hoof prints, too deep and too sharp to be more than an hour old, cutting across the trail before veering towards Silver Hollow. When he returned, the hotel looked as it had when he left, yet the air felt subtly altered, like a room where someone's breath still lingered. He checked the hatch. It was closed exactly as he'd left it. Down in the cellar, Emily sat cross-legged, the remains of the bread wrapped carefully in cloth beside her. Her grandfather was lying under the blanket, his breathing uneven. She didn't speak, only watched as Jonathan placed the new supplies on a crate near the stairs. He lingered a moment, sensing her eyes follow him as he closed the hatch. Outside, the wind had picked up again, carrying the faint sound of something wooden knocking against a wall somewhere down the street. Jonathan followed it far enough to find what he already expected: hoofprints again, circling the town, stopping just short of the hotel. The riders hadn't entered, but they had come close enough to let him know Silver Hollow wasn't as empty as he'd paid for it to be. He stood in the middle of Main Street, the sun sliding toward afternoon, and understood in a way he hadn't before. Whatever had chased Emily and her grandfather here was still out there, riding the same land he now called home. By the time the next dawn broke, the wind had shifted east, carrying with it the smell of damp earth from some far-off rain. Jonathan took it as a sign that the day would be quieter, but in the west, quiet often meant only that trouble hadn't yet arrived. He set about repairing the hotel's front porch, planing down warped boards and resetting nails that had worked themselves loose over years of neglect. The steady scrape of the plane against wood kept his thoughts anchored, but not enough to stop the unease that had settled in since finding those tracks outside town. By mid-morning, the gelding's ears twitched toward the road, catching sounds before Jonathan did. The faint clop of hooves grew clearer, unhurried, yet purposeful. Two riders emerged from the wavering heat, dark coats, broad hats, and the same measured bearing of men who didn't come to talk unless they had reason. They slowed as they reached the heart of Silver Hollow, letting their horses' hooves drum against the packed dirt of Main Street. Jonathan set the plane aside, straightening on the porch with his hands resting lightly on the rail. The riders didn't tip their hats, they didn't need to. One of them, tall, wiry, his jaw sharp as a knife edge, swung down from the saddle, boots hitting the dust with a muted thud. His eyes took in the street, the well, the blacksmith shop, the faded sign above the saloon. Each glance felt like a weight, measuring, cataloging. The other rider stayed mounted, turning his horse in a slow arc to take in the edges of town, gaze pausing on every door and window. They didn't speak, and Jonathan didn't offer words either. Instead, they studied one another in the dry stillness, the wind slipping between buildings with a faint hiss. The taller man's eyes lingered on the hotel's door a beat too long before he gave a subtle nod to his partner. Without hurry, both turned their horses back toward the road they came from. The sound of their departure was almost nothing, the soft clatter of iron shoes fading into the horizon, but the absence they left behind felt heavier than their presence. Jonathan waited until the dust settled before stepping down from the porch. He walked the length of the street, noting where fresh hoofprints overlapped older ones, tracing the same deliberate circuit around town. Back at the hotel, he stood for a long while at the hatch to the cellar, one hand resting on the iron ring. He didn't open it, but he knew Emily had heard the hoofbeats. He knew her grandfather had too, even if the coughing had masked it. Down there, the air would have grown colder, the silence tighter, as if the walls themselves had listened. Jonathan stepped away without lifting the hatch. The time for questions would come, but the ground between them was still too thin to bear that weight. For now, the rider's visit was enough of a message. Silver Hollow was still on someone's map, and its new owner had already been marked. The heat had a weight to it that morning, pressing down from the moment the sun rose, baking the ground until every step sent up a faint puff of dust. Jonathan was on the trail to Fairwater before the light had fully broken over the bluffs, his gelding's ears flicking irritably at biting flies. The leather of the saddle had grown warm to the touch even in the early hour, and each slow breath the horse released seemed to melt into the still, shimmering air. The 12 miles between Silver Hollow and Fairwater were never silent, wind through sagebrush, the distant croak of a raven. But today, even those small sounds were muted. The trail cut across dry creek beds and skirting ridges, where sun-cracked stones rolled loosely underfoot. Jonathan's mind drifted back to the cellar, to Emily's face half-shadowed by the lamplight, and the rasping cough that came from the darkness behind her. He had told himself he was only buying supplies for his own use, but the image of that child splitting her bread to save a portion for the old man sat in his thoughts like an anchor. Fairwater's main street was already awake when he arrived. The blacksmith's rhythmic hammer rang against iron, the sound bouncing off false front buildings. Women swept dust from their steps in brisk strokes, and the smell of yeast drifted from the bakery on the corner. At first glance, it might have been any other day, but he felt it almost at once, the weight of eyes on him. Across the street, under the narrow strip of shade cast by the feed store's awning, stood the same two riders who had visited Silver Hollow days earlier. Their coats were the color of old charcoal, their hats low, brims shadowing their eyes. They weren't speaking, only watching, and their stillness had the kind of deliberation that made a man's neck itch. Jonathan swung down from the saddle and looped the reins over the hitch rail. Inside the general store, the air was heavy with burlap, lamp oil, and a faint sweetness from jars of molasses on the back shelf. The storekeeper looked up briefly, his eyes unreadable, and returned to polishing a line of tin coffee pots that gleamed as if they'd already been polished a dozen times that morning. Jonathan named his needs in a steady tone: beans, flour, salt, lard, a little sugar if the price was fair. Each request was met with the same response: flat, unhurried, as if reading from a script. Out of beans, no flour left, salt's all gone. The sacks behind the counter told a different story. A barrel of beans still sat half full, the flour bin more than a quarter. Jonathan didn't challenge the lies. In places like Fairwater, pushing against a closed door only made it shut harder. He settled for coffee and a small sack of oats for the gelding, his coins stacked quietly on the counter. On his way to the door, he caught fragments of conversation from a pair of men standing near the shelves. The words were low, as if they didn't want him to hear, but they carried all the same. "Da new fella in Hollow, harboring trouble, not gonna end well." The storekeeper didn't look up. Outside, the two riders hadn't moved. One shifted his stance, letting the coat fall open just far enough to show the same bad-shaped emblem Jonathan had glimpsed before. Shiny, well-kept, but belonging to no official law he recognized. The other watched him mount up, his expression as flat and dry as the land around them. The ride home felt different, as though the dust on the trail carried the taste of warning. A mile outside Fairwater, Jonathan noticed a small burlap sack tied to his saddle horn, the knot secure but not his own. Inside were 4 apples, spotted, bruised, but fresh. No note, no sign of who had left them. It was a gift, but one wrapped in silence, the kind of kindness that carried its own danger in a divided town. Back in Silver Hollow, the streets were empty. Jonathan stabled the gelding, carried the coffee and oats into the hotel, and only then lifted the cellar hatch. Emily was there, sitting cross-legged on the top step, as if she had been listening for him all morning. She didn't speak, but her eyes followed every movement as he set the apples down on a crate near her. Her fingers hovered over them before she chose one, rubbing the skin against her sleeve, as if polishing away the weeks she'd gone without something so fresh. That night, the air turned restless. A shutter somewhere down the street tapped gently against its frame, the sound riding the wind in uneven bursts. Jonathan sat in the hotel's front room with a lamp burning low, listening. Somewhere beyond the edge of town, faint but clear, hoofbeats came and went, measured, unhurried, and leaving no doubt in his mind. They had ridden through again, just close enough to be heard. Heat gave way to a cooler morning, the sky washed clean by a night wind that left the sage bright and the light sharp. Jonathan worked the yard behind the hotel with a quiet focus, stacking split boards, checking the hitch rail, brushing the gelding until its coat shone the color of fresh coffee. The small habit steadied his hands. Down below, the cough in the cellar paused and returned, as regular as a distant clock. He measured his time by it now, the way ranch hands used to measure days by the sun and the slow swing of a windmill. The road to Fairwater held the pale hush of early hour. The trail crossed an arroyo and lifted onto a low rise where the land widened and turned silver with grass heads. He rode without hurry, keeping the horse collected, eyes drifting to the scuffed edges of the path where 2 sets of hoofprints had come and gone in the last day. The prints didn't rush. They didn't need to. Fairwater stood under a high blue dome of sky, the storefronts throwing hard shadows across swept boardwalks. The general store door was propped open. The blacksmith's hammer rang at an even pace. A wagon rattled past with a stack of desks and chalk slates, the kind that fill a room with quiet industry. When it stopped before the old schoolhouse, a woman in a travel-worn dress stepped down from the seat and set her gloved hands to the work of lifting each piece inside. No fuss, no calling for help, just a calm, practiced rhythm. Jonathan left his horse at the rail outside the store. Inside, the bins looked fuller than last week, but the welcome remained thin. He purchased a spool of thread, coarse salt, a narrow sack of cornmeal, small things that a man cannot be refused without turning a refusal into a public statement. Coins slid across the counter. The scoop moved reluctantly. He kept his gaze steady and his shoulders loose. The street glare struck as he stepped out. He set a boot to the stirrup, caught the reins in his left hand, and shifted weight. The leather gave with a quick, treacherous whisper. The gelding tossed its head, bit pulled by nothing, reins falling slack in 2 separate strips that slapped against the horse's neck. For a heartbeat, the animal rose into that cold, thoughtless space where panic lives. Jonathan moved on instinct, one hand to the withers, the other to the halter strap under the jaw, his voice low in a tone that had settled 1,000 skittish calves. The horse came down hard, blowing, eyes bright. Around him the air changed. Not a word from the doorway of the store, but the shape of mouths turned a fraction, the angle of shoulders shifted, the kind of silence that says a thing has happened and will be remembered. The cut edges of the reins were clean and straight, done by a steady hand and a patient knife. From across the street, the woman from the schoolhouse crossed through the heat shimmer. She moved with the assurance of someone used to being underestimated. A small tin of harness punch and awl hung from the loop of her bag, along with a roll of cotton cord and a folded scrap of leather. She offered them without ceremony. Her eyes flicked to the split ends, then to the watching faces, then back to Jonathan with a simple, practical question that needed no words. Repair now, or stand here longer than is wise. They worked side by side at the rail, the sound of the awl crisp in the hush. She held the strap steady, while he threaded the cord and drew it tight, knot after knot, making a temporary splice that would hold from Fairwater to the horizon. Dust smeared the edge of her glove. She didn't seem to notice. When the last knot lay neat and stubborn beneath his thumb, she gave a brief, approving nod and stepped back to let him test the fix. The gelding mouthed the bit, ears turning toward the schoolyard, where a child's laugh had risen and fallen like a small bell, one of those rare sounds that still found its way into towns like this. There were eyes in the shade under the feed store awning, the same 2 riders, unmoving. They watched not with surprise but with the attention of men taking note of who helped whom. Jonathan guided the horse along the boardwalk, stopping by the schoolhouse. The woman, Anna Whitford, as a painted trunk inside the doorway quietly testified, carried 2 readers to a window, tapped dust from their covers, and set them gently on a newly scrubbed desk. When she turned back, the look she gave him carried no alarm, only the settled understanding of a person who has already decided what kind of neighbor she will be. No declaration, no promise, just a choice, visible in the set of her shoulders. The ride back took longer than usual. He kept the pace even to spare the splice, the leather creaking with a new pattern of sound. Halfway to Silver Hollow, he opened his canteen and sat under the scant shade of a cottonwood, the world around him breathing in slow, warm waves. From that quiet, a memory surfaced, the first time he'd mended something after his loss, not because it would be perfect again, but because it deserved not to be thrown away. He understood the difference now between isolation and solitude. One takes, the other gives back if tended. Silver Hollow waited in its familiar hush. He carried supplies inside, then lifted the cellar hatch. Emily sat on the step with a folded blanket across her knees, as if she had been ready to climb if the sound above had turned wrong. He set the cornmeal and salt on a crate and placed a small cloth-wrapped bundle beside them, a reader rescued from a schoolhouse stack with a corner bent and a split seam. Small things can be provisions too. The girl's gaze rested on the worn cover, and the room's air seemed to expand by an inch. Near sundown, a light wagon approached the edge of town, then paused uncertain. It rolled forward slowly, stopping shy of the well. The woman from Fairwater stepped down with a basket and a covered jar balanced carefully against her hip. The evening wind skimmed along Main Street, lifting strands of her hair and carrying the clean scent of soap and baking. She stood for a moment, measuring the distance from her world to his. Beyond her, on the ridge east of town, 2 shapes sat, horses, and watch the scene with the patience of men who prefer others to speak first. Jonathan crossed the porch. The cough rose from the cellar, thin and frayed. The riders on the ridge did not move. The schoolteacher shaded her eyes with one hand and took a step toward the hotel door, neither bold nor tentative, only sure. Between them lay the kind of choice that alters more than one life, and the air held still, as if waiting to see which side of the line each of them would stand on. Morning came without ceremony, the kind where light didn't so much break as seep in, slow, cautious, touching each wallboard as if checking whether it belonged. Jonathan stepped out onto the porch with his coffee, the steam curling into the cool air. The ridge to the east stood clear. No silhouettes, no riders, just the clean, hard line where earth met sky. Still, he felt their absence as a presence, the way a closed door still shapes a room. Anna Whitford had left the basket the night before. It sat on the porch beside the door, neatly covered with a cloth weighted by a smooth river stone. Inside, a loaf of bread, 2 small jars of apple preserves, and a length of homespun cloth folded with precise care. There was no note. The offering was silent, but not without a voice. Jonathan carried the bread and preserves down to the cellar before the day had properly warmed. Emily was awake, her hair tied back with a strip of faded calico. The old man propped slightly against the wall, eyes closed but breathing easier than the day before. She touched the loaf like it might vanish if handled too quickly, then looked at Jonathan as if measuring whether gratitude should be spoken aloud or kept between them. He only nodded once and set the preserves beside her. By late morning, Jonathan was outside mending the fence line that edged the north side of town. The wood was dry and brittle, the nails rusted thin, but each post he set straight felt like stitching a torn seam. Slow work, but visible proof of care. The sound of the hammer carried over the empty street, echoing faintly off the false fronts. He didn't hear the wagon until it was halfway into town, the same one from the day before, pulled by a single chestnut mare with a steady gait. Anna sat on the seat, hands light on the reins. The schoolhouse door was propped wide, and she began unloading a small stack of books, a chalkboard, and a crate of bottled ink. Jonathan kept to his fence until her shadow lengthened into his workspace. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her gaze followed the repaired section of fence, the upright posts. The dust brushed from the rail tops. It was the look of someone seeing not just the task, but the choice behind it. They worked in companionable silence, she passing him tools, he steadying a post while she drove the top nails. In the absence of words, the sound of their work took shape. The dull thud of wood settling into the ground, the rasp of the saw blade, the short breaths between each swing of the hammer. From the edge of the north ridge, a flicker of movement caught Jonathan's eye. 2 riders, the same dark silhouettes, pausing just long enough to take in the scene. They didn't approach, but neither did they turn away. Anna followed his gaze for a moment, then went back to work without comment. By the time the sun touched the far ridge, the fence stood straight and unbroken. Anna gathered her gloves and walked back toward her wagon, her skirt brushing lightly against the dust. Jonathan stood a moment longer, watching her climb to the seat and guide the mare toward the road to Fairwater. The town was quiet again, but it was no longer the same kind of quiet as before. The repaired fence, the smell of fresh bread from the cellar, the wagon tracks pressed into Main Street, they marked something small but undeniable. Jonathan knew the riders had seen it too, and in their world, even small changes had a way of drawing attention. The wind shifted overnight, coming down from the high country with the faint scent of pine and the sharper, drier edge of dust from far-off trails. Jonathan woke before the first light, the air cool enough to see his breath as he poured water into the basin. His reflection in the rippled surface looked older than he remembered, lines etched deeper, eyes set with the watchfulness that had crept in since Silver Hollow stopped being just his own. The cellar was quiet except for the slow rhythm of breathing. Emily was still asleep, her grandfather awake but unmoving, gaze fixed on the lamplight above. Jonathan set down a tin cup of fresh water, and the old man's eyes followed his hand with the slow focus of someone weighing whether to speak. For a long moment the air between them held steady, then the man's voice rose, dry, measured, carrying the deliberate weight of someone who'd been holding back. He told the story without flourish. Years ago, this had been his town to keep safe, sheriff's badge on his chest, the law held together by handshakes and grit. Then came the Committee of Order, men who spoke of safety and stability while moving contraband through the same streets. When he stood against them, they came at night, not with gunfire, but with ruin, contracts pulled, livelihoods broken, friends turning away. By the time the dust settled, Silver Hollow was theirs in name if not by deed. and he was on the run with only his granddaughter and the clothes they could carry. Jonathan listened in stillness, each detail falling into place like nails in a board. The visits from the riders, the whispers in Fairwater, the way Emily's eyes had searched the horizon whenever the wind changed. It wasn't just bad luck that had driven them here. It was a trail of deliberate pressure, long and patient. The old man's voice faltered, the words drying up. He didn't ask for help, didn't make promises. He simply fixed Jonathan with a look that carried all the weight of a man too tired to defend his own ground anymore. Jonathan left the cellar with the first warmth of the sun touching the hotel porch. The air seemed different now, not just empty but expectant, as if the town itself had been listening. By midday, he walked the length of Main Street, stopping at the blacksmith's to clear the debris from the forge, at the saloon to push open windows swollen shut by years of neglect. He set the pump handle at the well swinging, water splashing bright into the trough. The motions were steady, deliberate, visible signs that Silver Hollow still had hands willing to tend it. Late in the afternoon, Anna appeared at the schoolhouse, her wagon lighter than before. She carried a broom to the doorway, her sleeves rolled, hair pulled back in a simple knot. Jonathan didn't speak of what he'd learned that morning. She didn't ask why he worked with such purpose, but in the shared silence between their tasks, the day took on a different shape, one less about mending wood and more about claiming space. The sun dropped low, painting the fronts of the buildings in a warm, false peace. On the ridge, the riders appeared again, still and patient as stones. They didn't come down, but they didn't turn away either. The distance between them and the heart of town felt smaller now, and Jonathan understood. Knowing the truth had changed nothing about their presence, but it had changed everything about what he was willing to do next. The next morning, Jonathan began before sunrise. The air was crisp enough to sting the lungs, and the horizon carried the faintest wash of pale orange. He set himself to the task without hesitation, dragging boards from the collapsed livery, sorting what could be used from what would only feed the fire. Each hammer strike echoed down the street, bouncing off the empty storefronts, sounding almost like company. By mid-morning, the sound had drawn others. A man from the far end of town, lean and stoop-shouldered, appeared with a bundle of rope and a rusted crowbar. He didn't offer a greeting, just set the tools near Jonathan and joined in pulling warped planks from the skeleton of a side wall. Later, a woman brought a basket of nails that had been sitting in her barn for years. Then came another man with a barrel of water for mixing with the lime they found in the old stable. They worked without discussion of why. The rhythm of shared labor replaced the awkwardness of strangers. Each rebuilt section of wall, each swept boardwalk seemed to lighten the air a little. Even the wind that slid between the buildings felt different, less hollow, more alive. At the schoolhouse, Anna opened the windows and let in the scent of the day. She had children there now, a small cluster from scattered ranches, their voices faint but distinct over the sound of tools. Emily sat among them, her hair neatly combed, posture straight as if the desk were a place she belonged. Jonathan took breaks only to fetch water or check the gelding's hooves. Each time his eyes traveled instinctively to the ridge. The riders appeared just before noon, silhouettes sharp against the sun. This time there were 3 of them. They stayed longer, the horses shifting restlessly, nostrils flaring in the breeze. Even from a distance, the stillness of their bodies read as something more than observation. It was assessment. By late afternoon, the street had changed. The pump at the well stood upright and working. The blacksmith's roof no longer sagged. The saloon's door hung straight again on its hinges. There was a quiet satisfaction in the air, the kind that comes from seeing effort take shape in wood and iron. But as the sun slipped behind the ridge, shadows stretched long across Main Street, and the sense of accomplishment carried a thin thread of unease. Jonathan could feel it in the way the others lingered a little before leaving, as if measuring the risk of being seen here too often. When the last hammer was set down, the town returned to stillness, but it was no longer the same kind of stillness as when he first arrived. It was a stillness that waited, half hope, half warning, knowing that what had been rebuilt today was visible from every mile of open land around. The wind carried heat again, dry and sharp, the kind that cracked lips and made the boards of the hotel sigh as they warmed. Jonathan was in the street early, checking the repaired pump and clearing wind-blown debris from the trough. The sound of approaching hoofbeats came long before the riders appeared, distinct from the easy rhythm of a rancher's pace. This was slower, deliberate, the gait of men who wanted to be seen and heard. 3 of them rode in, the same figures that had been silhouettes on the ridge. They did not stop at the edge of town this time. The lead rider was broader than the others, his coat unbuttoned despite the heat, a dust-stained scarf loose at his neck. His horse was a deep chestnut, well-fed and restless, tossing its head against the reins. The other 2 flanked him, riding just far enough behind to make their leader's position clear. They drew up in the center of Main Street. The leader dismounted slowly, stretching his shoulders as though the ride had been nothing more than a prelude. His eyes moved across the buildings, pausing on the pump, the straightened saloon door, the cleared street. When his gaze settled on Jonathan, there was no rush to speak, only the faint narrowing of his eyes, as if the sight of the town in this state was an answer to a question he hadn't yet asked aloud. The man stepped closer, boots sending up small clouds of dust with each measured stride. Jonathan stayed where he was, the space between them filled with the groan of a loose shutter somewhere behind the hotel and the steady stamp of the chestnut's hoof. When the leader finally spoke, his voice was low, carrying more certainty than threat, though the difference was thin. He acknowledged the work done here, the signs of life returning, and framed it not as praise but as trespass. Silver Hollow, he said, had its place in the order of things, and that order did not include strangers remaking it. There was still time to leave quietly. 1 week, no quarrel, no trouble. If the week was enough. Jonathan didn't answer immediately. The silence between them drew tight. Somewhere down the street, a door creaked open and closed again. The two riders, still mounted, had their eyes fixed not on him but on the buildings around, noting every gap, every face that might be looking from behind a curtain. The leader stepped back at last as if his point had been made. He swung into the saddle with the ease of a man who had done it 1,000 times. The three turned together, hooves striking in unison, heading east the way they had come. They didn't look back, but the dust they left behind hung in the air long after they'd disappeared from view. Jonathan stood in the street until the last of it settled. The town was quiet again, but the kind of quiet that holds its breath. Behind him, the repaired pump dripped steadily into the trough, each drop loud in the stillness, counting down a week that had already begun. The week passed without a single rider entering town, but the absence was heavy, the way clouds hang before a storm. Each day, Jonathan worked the street and buildings as if the threat had not been made, mending the last gaps in the fence, clearing brush from the edges of the well, checking the schoolhouse roof for loose shingles. Others came quietly to help. The stoop-shouldered man from the far end of town brought a cart of scrap lumber. The woman who'd brought nails before arrived with a pail of whitewash, leaving streaks of fresh brightness on the saloon walls. Even a pair of ranch hands from beyond the ridge stopped long enough to carry a few barrels into the blacksmith shop. No one spoke of the deadline, but every gesture carried the knowledge of it. Anna kept to her work at the schoolhouse, her presence steady. The children's voices rose and fell behind the open windows, mixing with the sound of tools in the street. Emily was there each day, her posture straighter now, her face less guarded. The old man remained in the cellar, strength returning slowly, but still bound to the chair near the cot. On the 6th day, Jonathan noticed signs along the road, hoof prints, deeper and more numerous than before, stopping at the crest of the ridge where the riders had so often waited. The prints were fresh enough that the dust still curled at their edges. The 7th day came with a sky the color of tarnished silver, clouds stretched thin and high. Jonathan was up before dawn, walking the length of the street, checking each building as if taking inventory. By midday, a hush had settled over Silver Hollow. Doors were closed, curtains drawn back just enough for narrow glimpses. It was late afternoon when the sound began. Hoofbeats, not 2 or 3 this time, but many, their rhythm uneven and echoing between the low hills. Jonathan stepped onto the hotel porch. What came into view was not the 3 riders from before, but dozens of figures, moving without haste down the main road towards Silver Hollow. For a moment, he thought they had come early, the committee's men arriving in force, but then he heard it. Boots on wood, not horseshoes on stone. People stepping from their homes, from the alleys, from behind the buildings at the far end of town. The footsteps grew louder, filling Main Street. Tools in hand, shovels, hammers, axes balanced over shoulders, they walked with the quiet certainty of those who have already decided what line they will not cross. Jonathan stayed where he was, the sound closing in, a tide of presence without a single shouted word. And then the first figures reached the center of town, turning to face the road to the east. Behind them, more followed until the street was full. Out on the ridge, the dark silhouettes appeared, horses shifting against the reins. The distance between the two sides was still great, but it no longer felt unbridgeable. The air held still, as if waiting to see which way the wind would turn. Spring arrived in Silver Hollow, with a kind of quiet triumph. The season didn't announce itself in grand gestures. There were no sudden rains or lush blooms, but in smaller, persistent signs. The air lost its bite. The wind carried the faint sweetness of mesquite blossoms, and the cold, hollow nights gave way to evenings warm enough for doors and windows to stay open. Jonathan noticed it first in the way light moved through the town. In winter, it had crept cautiously over the rooftops and along the warped boardwalks, hesitant to linger. Now it poured freely down Main Street, spilling into every doorway, illuminating the straightened fences, the repaired walls, the glass panes that had been wiped clean of years of dust. Where there had once been silence, there was sound, subtle, layered and alive. The steady creak of the well's handle, the sharp rhythm of a hammer against wood, the soft, uneven steps of a child crossing the street with a basket balanced in her arms. Laughter slipped out from the schoolhouse windows, tangling with the warm breeze. The blacksmith's shop rang again, metal meeting metal, its echo bouncing down the street like a heartbeat. Emily was different now. She moved through the town with purpose, her braids swinging behind her as she carried chalk and slates from the schoolhouse to Anna's desk. She paused often to speak with the townsfolk, returning a borrowed tin cup here, handing off a bundle of kindling there. She smiled more freely, the guarded look in her eyes replaced by something brighter. The old man, her grandfather, sat outside most mornings in a sturdy chair Jonathan had built from salvaged wood. Wrapped in a blanket, he let the sun rest on his face, his cough softer and less frequent. People stopped to speak with him, and he began to answer in more than nods, his voice regaining both strength and weight. Jonathan walked the length of Main Street that afternoon, his boots leaving fresh prints in dust now crossed and recrossed by dozens of others. The wagon ruts told their own story. Deliveries from Fairwater, trips to the outlying ranches, movement in and out not for fear or flight, but for trade and neighborly calls. The town's heart, once still and guarded, now beat steady. Anna was at the schoolhouse door, hair pinned back loosely, sleeves rolled past her elbows as she brushed chalk from her hands. She caught his eye, and the look they exchanged needed no words. It carried the history of the past months, every cautious decision, every unspoken agreement to stand in place when it would have been easier to walk away. The Committee of Order hadn't returned. No one could say whether they'd been discouraged by the sight of a town that refused to bend, or had simply decided Silver Hollow was no longer worth their trouble. But their absence was a presence of its own, space that could now be filled by other things. Jonathan ended his walk back at the hotel porch. He stood there for a long time, leaning against the rail, taking in the scene before him. Doors stood open, letting the warm air drift in. Curtains swayed lightly in the windows. The sound of footsteps carried up the street, firm, unhurried, going in all directions at once, to the well, to the schoolhouse, to the homes that now had smoke curling from their chimneys again. Months ago, those footsteps had been a warning, each one a reminder that he was not alone in a place meant to be empty. Now they were a promise. They spoke of people who belonged here, who intended to stay, who would notice if one day his own steps were missing from the pattern. The horizon beyond the ridge lay empty, washed in the soft gold of late afternoon. No riders, no watchers, just the land as it had always been, open, waiting, and for the first time in years, unclaimed by fear. Jonathan thought of the man he'd been when he arrived here, quiet to the point of vanishing, carrying more loss than he'd believed possible, content to disappear into the cracks of a forgotten place. That man had expected nothing but solitude. He hadn't imagined he might find something stronger than that, something better. It wasn't just safety. It wasn't only the mended buildings or the return of the market or the sound of the pump. It was knowing that in this place, his absence would matter, that if work began and his hands weren't there, someone would ask where he was, that his shadow now fell alongside others. When the sun dropped low over Main Street, Silver Hollow no longer belonged to him alone, and for the first time since he could remember, Jonathan Crowell had no desire to keep it that way.